Y'all can hear me, right? All right, cool. So again, I'm Irwin, and this is our work on privacy analysis at scale. So mobile apps are able to request access to all sorts of sensitive device resources and user information. Things like GPS coordinates, your contact list, photos, and things like that. Disclosures, such as this permission screen right here, show what apps might be able to do, which could be useful for end users, but this doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't say if an app actually exercises these privileges, and if they do, what remote services they share that sensitive data with. So to answer that question, we developed a dynamic analysis environment where we can actually observe how apps interact with that data and which remote services they send that data to. Now, compared to something like static analysis, we don't need to know anything about how an app is implemented. Additionally, all of the results from this system are actual empirical observations of app behavior, so there are no false positives. We accomplished this using tools we developed in two of our previous works. First, we have a custom Android 6 platform that we instrumented so we can monitor how apps use API calls to access those sensitive resources. And second, we have the Lumen privacy tool so we can analyze network traffic and see where that data is going to. In this environment, we're able to take any Android app, run it, and observe what the app does. But this being dynamic analysis, there is a bit of a missing piece. It's not enough for us to just run the app in this environment and just let it sit there on its initial screen. We actually have to progress the app somehow and do so in an automated manner for scalability. And we accomplish that using a tool that's included in the Android SDK called the Exerciser Monkey. Now, the monkey is pretty dumb. It just generates random taps and swipes with no regard for what's on the screen. In early testing, we found that, at least when it comes to children's apps, the monkey did about as well as undergraduate volunteers 60% of the time. There are more details in the paper if you'd like to know more. So we packaged up this environment and deployed it onto a cluster of physical smartphones that we run 24/7, just constantly churning through apps. This environment lets us see how apps access and share all sorts of information available on the device, from personal information, like the owner's name or geolocation, to a whole range of persistent identifiers on the device, like its IMEI or hardware ID. Now, as a case study for this system, we decided to look at how well mobile apps are abiding by the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA for short. Now, COPPA is one of the few comprehensive privacy regulations in the United States, and it governs how online services, such as apps, collect data about children under 13 years of age. It places prohibitions on the collection of personal information like geolocation, contact info, photography, audio. It prohibits building behavioral profiles of children over time and across different services, something that's enabled by persistent identifiers. It requires that parents give consent before apps can collect data. Now, verifiable parental consent might take on the form of something like credit card verification or a phone call, among other methods. It also asks that app developers and service providers take reasonable steps to protect the security and privacy of end users. And this thing has teeth. Violations can be pretty costly for companies that don't meet these requirements. And indeed, the US Federal Trade Commission has brought cases against developers of children's apps for violating COPPA. So for example, in 2015, app developers LAI Systems and RetroDreamer were fined $360,000 for sharing persistent identifiers from children with advertising networks. And it's not just app developers that are covered by COPPA. The third-party SDKs that developers include in their products can be held liable as well. Now, they may include these SDKs for such purposes as graphics engines, communications, analytics, or advertising. For example, in 2016, the advertising firm InMobi paid nearly a $1 million fine for collecting location data from children. So we have this system and we have this law. How do we find products to evaluate for this? Well, luckily for us, in the Google Play Store, there's this handy family heading, which such child-specific categories as ages 6 through 8 and pretend play. Apps that are listed under the family category have opted into the Design for Families program, or DFF for short. Now, DFF allows developers to specify that, yes, they do intend to have children under 13 years of age in their audience, whether exclusively so or as part of a larger audience. In DFF, Google reserves the right to reject or remove apps that it deems are not relevant to children under 13 years of age. Additionally, DFF's terms require developers to affirm that not only are their apps COPPA compliant, but so too are the third-party SDKs that they bundle in the apps. So between November 2016 and March 2018, we continuously crawled the Play Store for apps. And we identified 5,800 free apps that are participating in the Design for Families program. On average, these apps had 750,000 installs apiece, and our corpus represented nearly 1,900 different developers. So we took these apps, ran it through our system, and we found the majority of them are in potential violation of COPPA. We define potential violations as falling under one of four broad behaviors, whether they collected personal information without parental consent, whether they enabled behavioral advertising through the misuse of non-resettable identifiers when resettable ones are available, whether they integrated third-party SDKs that may not be COPPA compliant themselves, or whether they failed to take basic security measures to protect end users. Now, note that these percentages don't add up to 57%, and that's because many apps were actually observed, committing more than one of these. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to go over the details for these. So we found apps that were accessing email addresses, phone numbers, and find geolocation data in this corpus. Recall that we have a dumb monkey driving these apps. What it does cannot possibly constitute verifiable parental consent. Additionally, if a monkey can produce these results, then so too can a young child just, banging away and playing in the app. The most common kind of PII we observed being accessed and transmitted was find geolocation data. We found apps that were accessing the device's GPS capabilities and then exfiltrating that data to domains that belong to various advertising networks. We also found apps that were accessing data about Wi-Fi routers, which can be used to infer geolocation with high accuracy. Some popular apps were found doing this. So for example, there's Fun Kid Racing, which has over 10 million installs according to the Google Play Store, and we found it using the device's GPS capabilities and then sending that data to various advertising services. For the developer of this app, we found that they had 82 apps that were listed under Design for Families. 81 of them were seen engaging in this behavior. Less common was collecting contact information, so email addresses and phone numbers. But still, we saw this happening. And we saw that data mainly going to various developer services, advertising companies, and app recommendation engines. Now, beyond just personal information, COPPA also prohibits behavioral advertising for children, which relies on tracking users over time and across different services, something that's enabled by persistent identifiers. In 2014, Google recognized the privacy implications of persistent identifiers, and they introduced the user-resettable Android advertising ID. That allows users a little more control over how advertisers track them. Since then, Google has required developers and advertisers to use the AAID in lieu of non-resettable identifiers such as the IMEI or the Wi-Fi MAC address. Still, we found a large chunk of DFF apps sharing the AAID alongside another non-resettable identifier, which totally defeats its purpose. Among advertising services, we found that compliance with this policy varied widely, from Chartboost, who only basically took it as a suggestion, to Google's own DoubleClick, and they followed their own rules. And as noted before, it's not just app developers that are subject to COPPA. Third-party SDKs themselves have been found liable. And so some of these services have allowed developers to specify that, yes, this SDK is going to be integrated into a children's app. This allows the SDK to adjust its data collection behaviors in compliance with law. So for example here, this is for the Unity game engine. Developers can say, I'm building a game for kids. Half of our corpus used the Unity game engine. However, when we examined the network traffic, we found that this option wasn't being set most of the time, which suggests that a lot of these apps are potentially operating in a non-compliant mode. Other third-party SDKs don't even offer that option. Instead, what they tell developers is, don't use us in apps at all. Presumably, this is because these services are operating on, are collecting data and processing data in ways that may be prohibited by COPPA, and so these services just don't even want to deal with children's data. However, we found nearly 1 in 5 DFF apps sharing personal information or persistent identifiers with these verboten SDKs, as we like to call them. Now, remember that DFF is an opt-in program. Developers went out of their way to represent that their games are meant for users under 13 years of age. Still, these verboten SDKs can be found in many self-declared DFF apps, which in aggregate accounted for hundreds of millions of installs. And when it comes to sharing sensitive data, COPPA requires these apps and services to do so in secure ways. So for the purposes of our research, we took that as something as simple as using encrypted HTTP. Still, we found 40% of DFF apps transmitting identifiers and personal info without taking that measure. So again, between the collection of personal info without verifiable parental consent, the use of persistent identifiers, even when user-resettable ones are available, integration with potentially non-compliant third-party SDKs, and failure to implement basic security measures, we found that a majority of Design for Families apps are in potential violation of COPPA. So that sounds pretty bad. These potential violations are widespread. So you might be asking, where are the enforcers? Well, regulatory agencies like the FTC understandably have finite enforcement capacity. Now, COPPA recognizes this and has a provision that allows industry to self-regulate through safe harbors, such as these 7 on the screen. App developers can submit their products to these safe harbors, who then review and certify their apps for COPPA compliance. So we looked at those safe harbors websites and figured out what apps and companies they might cover. And we found that they really weren't any better than DFF apps as a whole, and might be worse in some cases. So for example, RailRush, which has over 50 million installs, was reviewed by Children's Advertising Review Unit, and we observed that not only was it sharing fine location data without parental consent, it was sharing that data with the analytics service Amplitude, whose own terms say don't use it in children's apps. So given all these results, what do we think can be done? Well, we offer recommendations to the stakeholders in the mobile app ecosystem. First, developers need to be careful when selecting the SDKs they integrate with. They need to use compliant SDKs, and when they do that, they need to ensure that they use options, any options that are available for compliance. On the other side of that equation, the third-party SDK providers need to enforce their own terms, especially if they're behavioral advertising companies that may be dealing with children's data. Platform providers such as Google are the principal gatekeepers in this space. They're in a position to, for example, use our techniques in their pre-release app testing to identify these problems ahead of time. And I just wanted to point out that one of the verboten SDKs we identified was Crashlytics, which is also owned by Google. So they're in an excellent position to address this. And finally, for regulators, researchers, and the public at large, we make all of our results available on our website, appcensus.mobi. Ultimately, though, we believe that our methods and results reveal an opportunity for the other stakeholders, the developers, the SDK providers, and the platform providers to step up and address what's truly a privacy issue at scale. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions.
And before we get to the questions, you might have noticed the air conditioning, I think, has just kicked on. They were just working on that, so yay! And first question.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So I noticed you being a bit hedgy.
Yeah.
You were saying these are potentially in violation.
Yes.
It seemed from what you presented, they were clearly in violation.
So,
of course, you are not a lawyer.
You would like us to comment on it. In our team, we did have a lawyer as one of the authors, and we have to hedge it ultimately because for there to be penalties and legal action, you do need case-by-case analysis. And ultimately, what we offer with this system is a bird's-eye view of the mobile app privacy landscape, something that regulators really don't have before this.
One other issue is when data is going to, say, a company that's that business is behavioral advertising. It's possible that they have contractual obligations with some of the app developers, that say that data from these apps needs to be treated differently. And from the outside looking in, we have no way of knowing that. So while it might seem that the data is going to be used for behavioral advertising, we can't definitively prove that.
But it's sent without encryption in the clear.
Sure. Well, but so that's the other issue. So that's another issue why we kind of hedge there. The statute says using reasonable security measures. TLS seems like it's a reasonable security measure, but again, that's a decision for a court to make.
Hi, this was really great. Thanks.
Thanks.
Could you talk a little bit about the landscape of other platform providers and whether their enforcement's any better?
Yeah, so I'm sure you're mainly asking about Apple.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, our data only covers Android because Apple is a closed platform. A lot of our tools we basically bake it into the OS, so it's more or less transparent to the apps we're testing. One thing I can comment on is that a lot of these third-party SDKs we identified, they're cross-platform. So I can't say definitively whether they behave any differently under iOS, but they are available under iOS, presumably with similar capabilities.
Other questions? Okay, we'll take one last question. Actually, back there.
Has there been any press coverage of your work?
Yes, a fair bit actually. We've had press coverage. Serge has been on NBC News, and we've also got legal threats. So that's fun.
We posted one of the legal threats on the.
Yeah. So go on the blog. Look for the post. Whoops. Look for the post that says "We Get Letters," and you can see it all there.